Hi everyone, I'm Anya. Welcome back to my channel. I guess it's been a while. The past few months have been really challenging, and honestly I struggled a lot to figure out how and when to come back to YouTube. Because honestly, like, whatever I had to say about writing wouldn't really be relevant or appropriate in light of all the other much more important events and protests that are going on around Black Lives Matter all over the world. And I didn't want to center myself as a non-Black person and non-Black creator in this time. But that being said, I still believe that reading and writing can be such a powerful tool for healing, for liberation, for expressing yourself, for learning empathy. And obviously at this time in particular, it's especially important to amplify the voices of Black authors. So I decided to come back with this video of a wrap-up of books that I've read recently by Black authors, both, traditional wrap-up types of thoughts about the books in general, and also things that I learned about writing from them because I couldn't help myself. And that's what the focus of this channel really is. And then at the end, I'll tell you about some books by Black authors that are on my TBR that I'll hope to talk about in future videos coming up. I really want to encourage you to buy these books, other books by Black authors, or to get them from the library if you can't buy them, and also to continue protesting and donating and calling and emailing and using your voice to speak up for the rights of Black people, whether you're in the US or abroad, because as important as reading and writing is, it's really those actions that are going to make the change that we need to see right now. So I would encourage you to join me in continuing to do those things and also reading. So the first book that I want to talk about is With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo. And this was actually the first book of mine that I've read by her, even though, after she got popular with The Poet X, I'd been meaning to read her books for a while, but I actually really enjoyed this book. It's about a high schooler named Emily who loves cooking, and she's a teen mom, and there's sort of dual storylines in this book about her relationship with her daughter, with the father of her daughter, with her new boyfriend, and then also with this culinary arts program that she takes and her sort of journey in developing her cooking career and her love for cooking. So this book is actually written in prose, not in verse like Acevedo's other books are, but the writing is still really, really poetic, and it's got some beautiful descriptions, and that's one of the things that I loved about this book. And the short chapters are almost like vignettes or poems in and of themselves that really help to keep the pace moving along while still allowing readers to enjoy these small moments of joy and of sorrow. And obviously, because it's a book about cooking, there's a lot of recipes and descriptions of foods and the sort of unusual combinations of foods that Emily makes, which for me was honestly the perfect book. And I would even say that I wanted more. I wanted more descriptions of food, but there were some really delicious descriptions in there, and I was totally hungry by the end of it. Now, as for what I learned from this book, I've actually made another video that talks about writing romance when you've never been in love, and I use With the Fire on High as an example of some of the tropes and expectations, readers' expectations that you can draw upon when you're trying to write romance. And so I'll link to that below when it's up. But basically, I thought this was a great example of a YA romance that follows a lot of the conventions of the genre, but still does so in a way that feels fresh and really sweet and works well because of Emily's strong characterization, which makes the whole relationship feel meaningful. And there's also something about the romance that I wanted to talk about, which is that it touches a lot on respecting each other's boundaries, and I think that's something that needs to be talked about more in YA romances, and that I thought Acevedo did really well, and not at all in an awkward or unnatural way. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting about the writing, and that I really want to apply to my own writing, was the way that Acevedo incorporates just these little touches of magic into the world. And I wouldn't say it's enough to really be called magical realism. I don't think it quite gets to that level, but there's just little phrases and touches that really make the reader question whether is this just a delicious meal or is this actually magic? And I absolutely loved that because it really helped to convey Emily's deep love for food, and also just gave the book overall a sort of whimsy and a fantastical quality that I really loved. And I think this was a great reminder of how both in books with magic, with explicit magic, and without, it's okay to have instances of things where it's just sort of on the border of the supernatural. The reader isn't quite sure whether it's magic or not. And regardless of whether it is or isn't, it doesn't even matter. It just really adds to the atmosphere in both cases. And so that, I think, is something that Acevedo does a really good job of. So the next book that I read was Binti by Nydia Okorafor. And it's a novella about a girl named Binti who is the first person from her people who are called the Himba to be accepted to the most prestigious university in the galaxy. And so she goes off on this journey to get to the university. And because her people, the Himba, don't usually leave their homeland, Binti faces discrimination almost immediately from the other incoming students. And eventually she also has to face an alien attack that threatens the ship that she's on. I also enjoyed this book. I think most of my complaints about it were really just because it was so short, which I know is not helpful at all, but I just wanted more of the world building, especially of these sort of near supernatural mathematical powers that Binti has. And also a more nuanced development of sort of the themes of cultural difference and cultural acceptance, and just of the plot, and especially the climax itself. Still, I really loved the exploration of Binti's cultural heritage and the way that it actually played a substantive role in the plot. Like, you could not have had this same story if it were not for Binti's cultural background and the traditions and customs of the Himba. I think that really bothers me sometimes, where it seems that diversity or non-Western cultures are added into a book just for the sake of diversity itself, and you could basically have had the same story without it. And another thing I really loved about it was just the super intriguing hints about this very broad, this vast sci-fi world that made me think a little bit of like Nine Fox Gambit or Ancillary Justice or another one of those sci-fi books that just have this really huge world encompassed within the pages. And I guess, I'm still trying to decide whether or not to read the sequel, but my friend tells me that there's more world building in it, so I think I might. And I think the biggest thing that I learned about writing from Binti was that in a short novel, a novella, or even a short story like this, that you sort of have to give a broad cultural overview to give a sense of the world, but then focus in on like one or two elements that are actually really important so that readers have something to latch onto. So in this case, that would be the clay that the Himba spread on their hair and on their bodies, as well as those supernatural math powers that I was talking about. And both of those things are tied closely to the plot and also give a really strong sense of the ideals and the values and what's important to the culture. And so the culture ends up feeling really fleshed out, even though there's only these one or two elements that the author delves into more closely. And I think that's super important when you're writing short form fantasy. So the next book I read was Clap When You Land, also by Elizabeth Acevedo. I guess, clearly I liked With the Fire on High enough to go on to this one, and this one is a novel in verse. Again, as with the Fire on High, the language is really beautiful, and that was one of my favorite parts of this book. But the sort of back cover summary is that there are these two sisters called Camino and Yahaira. One lives in the US and one lives in the Dominican Republic, and they don't realize that they're sisters until their father is killed in a plane crash, and his funeral and their grieving for him bring them together. So I learned that this book was actually based on a real plane crash, which I had never heard about, and I thought that Acevedo had a really powerful portrayal of how monumental events like this have such a deep and lasting impact on the communities that they most affect, even if the media in general moves on from it, and someone like me would never really have heard of this crash before. And then Acevedo twines that with the sort of very personal grief that the two sisters feel when they discover that their father had a secret family, that he split his love between two countries, two families, the two sisters. And so you've got grief at this personal level and at this community level, except the personal grief also begins to expand out and becomes larger than either sister because of how it impacts their families, their futures, all sorts of, socioeconomic, financial issues, and in the case of Camino, her place in her community and her day-to-day safety. And then the last thing that really stood out to me was the depiction of sisterhood in this book, and Camino and Yahaira really are quite similar, even to such an extent that sometimes I had a hard time telling their narrative voices apart, but I thought it was really interesting that they've been raised in such different circumstances, and Acevedo uses that as a way to explore not only the really deep bond that they come to develop over the course of the book, but also differences in culture, in socioeconomic status, in nationality, etc., etc. So the biggest area of learning for me from this book was about how to even write an entire novel in poetry, because like you have to accomplish a lot of things that might seem sort of antithetical to the aims of poetry while still in verse. So like moving the plot along and describing just very day-to-day events, which sometimes I wouldn't really associate with poetry. And the cool thing about this is that Acevedo, as you know, a lot of poets do, really plays with the form and how the words look on the page. You know, using spacing and even like the shape of the stanzas to convey different elements of the tone and add deeper meaning to the language itself. So for example, at the very beginning, there's this section that I loved where Acevedo first describes Camino going to the airport. So you've got this really everyday normal action, and she uses long lines, almost like regular sentences and almost like paragraphs, to describe this, so it doesn't feel like you're lingering too long on this pretty normal action. But then it transitions to a section that's talking about sort of the premonition that you might get before something bad happens, and then she switches to using really short lines, small stanzas, so that the reader is forced to sit with each thought and each line and almost feel that sense of premonition and foreboding for themselves. So overall, I don't know if I would ever be able to write a novel in verse, but I think a lot of the strategies that Acevedo uses could really be applied to prose as well, whether that's pacing or the lengths of paragraphs and the sort of visual shape of the words on the page, and even the number of words that it takes to describe a certain event. I think having a consciousness of that, even when you're using prose, can make your writing a lot more interesting to read, because if poetry shouldn't just be one long block of text, then why should prose, you know? So the next book I read was Gingerbread by Helen Oyeyemi, and basically this is an adult literary fiction family drama about this girl named Perdita who is sort of, I won't say a regular high school, but she's a high schooler, and the story starts out pretty much in a relatively normal world where Perdita's mom, named Harriet, is sort of trying to enter the power hierarchy of the parents at Perdita's school, and Perdita is going about her life as a schoolgirl in England. But you know, oh, by the way, there's this gingerbread that they make that has a very strange sort of power over everybody that eats it, and Perdita is basically obsessed with this gingerbread, like she can't stop herself from eating it. And the gingerbread is the link to a story that Harriet tells, which takes up most of the middle section of the book, but it's basically the story of Harriet's girlhood and growing up, and especially her friendship with another girl, Gretel, who was also super obsessed with this gingerbread. So there's, you know, all kinds of weird things that happen in magical realism, but in the end, it's really a story about the family. And I won't lie, I kind of have no idea what hit me with this one. I'm really sure I'm not smart enough to understand the depth of the symbolism that's going on here, especially not on the first read. Like, the gingerbread symbolizes different aspects of being human, or nostalgia for a sort of lost childhood or an idealization of childhood, as well as something about sort of the essence of humanity, which is individual to each person. I don't really know. I found this quote at the end of the edition of the book that I had. It said, Oyeyemi's novels are exuberantly intellectual and highly readable, wildly inventive and classically resonant. That's true, but I would consider myself an exuberantly intellectual person, if you want to use that phrase, and I still had no idea what was going on. But regardless, I thought there was a lot that I could learn from the writing itself, which I really, really loved. Oyeyemi has a way of incorporating a sort of whimsical and humorous tone, even as her writing is richly symbolic and literary. I think whenever I try to write something literary, I sort of end up using a lot of long words and really long sentences, a bunch of semicolons, whatever. But she does the opposite, often making these super simple statements, or statements that seem simple on the surface, but then when you dig into them, are really not. And that's the basis of the style, I think, in this book, and what makes it really literary and really interesting and rich and beautiful to read. So you get lines like this. What Druhestranians wanted was to keep things simple and concentrate on upholding financial inequality. And then you've got lines like somebody crafting a perfectly fictitious CV. And then you have something like this. The second unhaunted house was in Western Bohemia, a low-lying structure easily missed amid fountain sprays of autumnal greenery, reddery, orangery, brownery, etc. And she does this with such a straight face, so to speak, that I think it really helps to create the distinctive atmosphere of the novel. I think it's a really good reminder that, you know, anyone can look at a thesaurus and craft really long, confusing sentences that no one can understand, but it's much more important to focus on creating a distinctive voice through these kind of literary idiosyncrasies. I think that's something that I need to focus on when I'm writing a more literary piece. Now, the last book that I want to talk about before I get to my TBR is Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. Now, this obviously is not a novel. For those who don't know, it's sort of a nonfiction reflection / journaling style book that helps white people and people who hold white privilege to unpack white privilege within themselves. And it's got a lot of reading and journaling prompts to help people confront internalized white supremacy. And it's really difficult, as it should be. And especially, I would say, at least in my experience, for people who hold white privilege but are still people of color. But she does a really good job of guiding you through learning and thinking and reflecting on yourself in a very directed and purposeful manner, which I think was something that I really needed. So obviously, because it's not a novel or really a narrative, it's harder to get like novel writing advice out of this, and I also absolutely don't want to diminish its value as an anti-racist tool, because obviously that's what it is first and foremost. That's the only thing that it needs to be. But that being said, I did find myself thinking about novel writing sometimes as I was reading it and doing the journaling prompts, and I just wanted to share some of my thoughts about that. So basically, while I was doing the prompts, I would find that certain events or thoughts or ideas would come up again and again. And each time they would come up, I would approach them in a different way or use slightly different words to describe them or become a little more comfortable explaining how they tied into these broader concepts of white supremacy and white privilege. So basically every time just becoming more and more familiar with those events. And that served as, I think, a really good reminder to me for similar things that you can do while you're writing a novel. So what I'm thinking of, I guess, is doing those sorts of writing exercises that are not going to end up in your final book, but things like describing scenery or describing a character or writing a scene between two characters that's not part of your overall narrative, just to become comfortable with those things as you're inventing them and sort of fleshing them out in your head. Now, I've done this before, and it honestly really helped to have these sort of thoughts and images and even certain phrases that I could draw on and come back to when I was actually writing the novel, so that those things would come out naturally and fully formed, and avoid that problem of like figuring out what you're doing as you're doing it and then having to go back and edit the beginning, which I always do. And you know, obviously some people write that way, but for me, I think Me and White Supremacy was just a really good example of the power of just repetitive writing and repetitive thinking to develop certain ideas. So now I think it's time for my TBR. The first book on my list is A Song Below Water by Bethany C. Morrow, which is a contemporary fantasy that, as I understand, is about like mermaids and sirens and race and gender, and just sounds like exactly the type of thing that I need in my life right now. And then I also have just gotten a copy of a short story anthology called Black Enough, Stories of Being Young and Black in America. It's a YA short story anthology. And then lastly, I'm really excited to read The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, which is an adult novel about twin sisters who grow up. One leaves the town that they grew up in and one stays, and sort of one lives as white passing and one lives as black, and it's about their two stories. And it just sounds really interesting, and I love those stories with these sort of parallel storylines, so I'm really excited to read that. Anyway, I'd love to talk about any of these books or hear what folks thought about the books on my TBR, so leave a comment below. Again, I want to urge you to buy these books from Black-owned bookstores if you can. I'll leave a link to a list in the description below. And if you can't, borrow them from your library, request them from your library if they don't have them, and continue to take substantive action to support Black Lives Matter. If you're not sure how to do that, I'll leave some more resources in the description as well. Anyway, that's it from me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.